My mother chose my abusive stepfather over me. And I was forced to leave. 5 years later, they came to me for help. Now I have to decide if I can forgive. I am an 18-year-old male. I have lived with my mum and stepdad for the last 5 years. For the last 5 years, my life took a dramatic turn. When my biological father died in a car accident when I was 10. It was a difficult time for my mum and me. We struggled emotionally and financially for a couple of years. My mum met Mark when I was 12. They dated for a year and got married when I was 13. From the beginning, it was clear that Mark didn't like me. He always saw me as a burden. And a constant reminder of my mum's previous relationship. I remember the day they were married. While everyone was celebrating, I caught Mark giving me a cold, calculating look. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. I thought it was just wedding day jitters. Growing up, I tried my best to get along with Mark. I helped around the house, kept my grades up, and even tried to get involved in activities that he enjoyed, like watching football or helping him with his gardening. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. He'd always find a way to criticize me, or make me feel unwelcome. Mark would make snide comments about how I wasn't his real son, or how I was just wasting space in his house. He'd say things like, "If it was up to me, you'd be out on the streets where you belong. Or you're lucky that your mother loves you, because no one else would put up with a useless kid like you." These comments hurt. But I tried not to let them get to me. My mother would try to mediate when she witnessed these interactions, but she often sided with Mark to keep the play. She'd say things like, "He doesn't mean it," or "You need to try harder. You need to try harder to get along with Mark." It felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells in my own home. It got worse as I got older. When I turned 16 and got my first part-time job in a local grocery store. Mark made me pay rent. My mum thought it was a bit harsh, but she agreed that it would teach me responsibility. So a significant of my meager paycheck went to Mark each month. This left me with little to save or spend on myself. Recently, my mother received an amazing job opportunity abroad. She was offered a 6-month contract in Europe, which could potentially lead to a permanent position. When she first told me about it, I could see the excitement in her eyes. It was the first time I had seen her like that in years. Really happy about something. But my happiness for her was quickly overshadowed by the fear of living alone with Mark. I expressed my concerns to my mother and told her how Mark treated me when she wasn't around. I recounted incidents where he'd accidentally broken things that were important to me, like the model aeroplane my dad and I had built together before he died, or how he'd forget to buy food that I could eat, knowing that I had dietary restrictions. But my mum brushed it off and said I was, and that Mark was just being strict. She told me to give him a chance and that living together might help us bond. The day my mum left was one of the hardest days of my life. As we stood at the airport, I hugged her tightly. I fought back tears. I wanted to beg her to stay, not to leave me alone with Mark. But I couldn't bring myself to dampen her excitement. As she walked through security, Mark put his hand on my shoulder. To anyone watching, it may have looked like a reassuring gesture, but his grip was painfully firm. "Let's go home, boy," he said, his voice cold. "Things will be different now." And different they were. Things went downhill from the moment we got home. Mark started yelling at me for the smallest things. He'd yell if I left a dish in the sink, or if I came home 5 minutes later than usual. Once I accidentally left a light on in my room. When I went to school, when I came back, I found that Mark had removed all the light bulbs from my room. If you can't remember to turn the lights off, You don't deserve to have any, he said with a grin. He threatened to throw me out several times. He said he was only letting me stay because of my mother. One wrong move, he said, and you'd be out on the street. And who do you think your mother will believe? Me, her loving husband, or her ungrateful brat of a son? I tried to keep my head down and avoid confrontation. But it became unbearable. I couldn't concentrate on my studies. And my mental health deteriorated. My grades started to slip. I was constantly anxious and depressed. I called my mum a couple of times to tell her what was going on. But she always seemed distracted and told me to sort it out with Mark. I could hear the stress in her voice because of her new job. And I didn't want to add to her worries. One night, about 2 months into my mum's absence, things came to a head. I'd been working late at my job. I was covering for a sick colleague. I texted Mark to let him know I'd be home late. But when I arrived, he was waiting for me, seething with anger. He accused me of lying, of being out on drugs or getting into trouble. When I tried to explain, he called me worthless and said he was tired of having me around. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a box of my things. Old photos, my dad's watch, some school mementos, and threatened to throw them out. I begged him to stop. And in the struggle, the box fell and its contents scattered across the floor. As I scrambled to pick up my belongings, Mark towered over me. "This ends now," he growled. "I want you out of my house by tomorrow or I'll throw you out myself." Throw you out myself. That was the last straw. I realized I couldn't take it anymore. When Mark went to bed, I packed a bag with and left in the middle of the night. I stayed with my best friend for a few days before finding a small room to rent with my savings from my part-time job. I didn't tell my mum right away because I didn't want to worry her or jeopardize her job opportunities. I thought I'd explain everything when she got back. I blocked Mark's number because he kept sending me threatening messages. He said he'd call the police and report me as a runaway if I didn't come back. It's been a month now and I'm on my own. It's not easy. I'm working extra hours to pay for rent and basic necessities while trying to keep up with school. Some days I barely have enough to eat. But it's better than living under Mark's roof. I feel guilty about leaving without telling my mum. But I also feel like I had no choice. The constant fear and stress was crushing me. So I read it. ETA 4. I left my stepfather's house while my mum was abroad. Should I have tried harder to make things work? Should I contact my mum now and explain everything? I'm lost and could really use some advice. Edit. Thank you all for your replies. I've read them all and appreciate the support. Many of you have asked about my living situation and future plans. I'm currently living in a small studio apartment that I found through a friend. It's not ideal. The plumbing is temperamental, and I can hear my neighbor's every move. But it's safe and affordable. I work part-time at a local diner and do some online tutoring to make ends meet. As for school, I'm a senior and determined to graduate. I've been in contact with my school counselor about my situation, and they've been supportive in helping me stay on track. Some of you suggested to contact other family members. Unfortunately, my mother was an only child, and my grandparents died a few years ago. My father's side of the family lost contact with us after he died. It's pretty much just been me, Mum and Mark for the last few years. I'm still not sure how to deal with things. When my mum comes back, one part of me wants to tell her everything, but another part of me is afraid that she won't believe me. Believe me or side with Mark again. I guess I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. For now, I'm concentrating on staying afloat and finishing school. Thank you all again for your advice and kind words. Update 1. It's been 6 months since my original post. And a lot has happened. I wanted to give you all an update. My mum came back from her work abroad last week. I was nervous to see her. But I was also looking forward to finally everything that had happened with Mark. However, things didn't go as I had hoped. The day after she returned, I received a phone call from her. Her voice was cold and angry. Nothing like the warm, loving tone I was used to. She demanded to know if it was true that I had stolen money from Mark and run away. I was shocked and confused. My mind raced as I tried to where this accusation was coming from. I tried to explain what had really happened. How Mark had been verbally abusive. How he had threatened to throw me out. And how I had left for my own safety and mental health. I told her about the incident with the box of my belongings. How Mark had made my life miserable. Miserable every day she was away. But my mum wouldn't listen. She kept insisting that Mark had shown her proof of my theft. When I asked what proof, she was vague and said something about missing cash and suspicious bank transactions. I told her it was all lies. That I had never stolen anything in my life. I reminded her that I'd always been honest with her. How I'd worked hard at my part-time job to contribute to the household. But it seemed she had already made up her mind. I begged her to meet me in person, so that we could talk face to face. After some persuasion, she agreed. But when we met in a local cafe, Mark was with her. The moment I saw him, my heart sank. He had a sad expression on his face. But I could see the glint of triumph in his eyes. Mark was putting on a show. That he was worried and disappointed in me. He was spinning a story about how he had tried his best to look after me while my mum was away. But that I had become rebellious and started stealing money to fund a party lifestyle. He talked about how he'd noticed cash missing from his wallet. How he'd seen suspicious withdrawals from their joint account. I was floored. Every word that came out of his mouth was a lie. But he told it so convincingly. He even had forged receipts and bank statements that he claimed proved I'd been taking money. I don't know how he made them. But they looked real enough to fool my mother. He told me how he tried to confront me about it. But I had run away rather than face the consequences. I was desperate to defend myself and tell my side of the story. I explained how I'd worked extra shift to support myself. How I'd struggled to make ends meet in my small flat. I told them about the nights I'd gone to bed hungry because I couldn't afford both food and rent. I begged my mother to remember how I'd always been responsible with money. How I'd never given her any reason to doubt me. But Mark had clearly been working on my mum for weeks before she came back. He had poisoned her against me. Made her think I was a troubled, ungrateful child who had taken advantage of her absence. He made himself out to be the victim. A concerned stepfather who had only wanted to help his wayward stepson. The worst part was seeing the look of disappointment and anger in my mother's eyes. She told me she couldn't believe I'd done this to her. That she had trusted me to behave while she was away. When I tried to explain Mark's behavior, she accused me of trying to shift the blame and making up lies about her caring stepfather. How could you do this to us? She asked, her voice breaking. We gave you everything and this is how you repay us. Her words cut deep. Each one felt like a physical blow. I couldn't understand how she could believe this. Mark over me, her own son. The meeting ended with my mother telling me she needed time to think about what to do next. She said she couldn't take me back in the house if she couldn't. Believe me, as they left the cafe, I saw Mark put his arm around my mum's shoulders, comforting her. The sight made me sick. Over the next few days, I kept trying to reach out to my mum, to get her to listen to me without Mark's influence. But she either ignored my calls or replied with short, cold messages, telling me to stop lying and to take responsibility for my actions. I was desperate. I contacted some of my mum's friends, hoping they might be able to talk some sense into her. But it seemed that Mark had got to them too. They all told me how disappointed they were in me, how they couldn't believe I would steal from my own family. Finally, my mum sent me a long text message, saying that she had decided it was best if I didn't come home. She said she was very disappointed in me, and that she needed time to process things. She told me not to contact her for a while. I was devastated. Not only had I lost my home, but I'd also lost my mum, the one person I thought would always be on my side. Mark had managed to completely manipulate her, turned her against her own son. The next few weeks were a blur. I threw myself into work at school. I tried to distract myself from the gaping hole in my life where my family used to be. I had trouble sleeping. I often lay awake at night, replaying the conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said differently to make my mum believe me. My grades started to slip again, and I was in danger of not graduating. It took a concerned teacher to pull me aside to pull me out of my funk. She noticed the changes in me and asked me what was wrong. After some hesitation, I told her everything. To my surprise, she believed me. She helped me get in touch with a school counselor and a social worker. Who could provide me with resources and support. With their help, I was able to get back on track with my studies and even some additional financial support to help with my living expenses. Now I'm trying to figure out my next steps. I'm still in my small flat. I work as much as I can to support myself. I've reached out to a few trusted teachers at school who have been supportive and are helping me navigate finishing high school as an independent student. I'm hurt, angry and scared about the future. My mother's betrayal hurts deeply. And there are days when the loneliness feels overwhelming. But I'm also determined to prove Mark wrong and show my mum the truth one day. Mum, the truth one day. I don't know if our relationship will ever be the same again. But I haven't given up hope yet. For now, I'm concentrating on finishing high school and planning for college. It won't be easy. But I'm determined to make a better life for myself, with or without the support of my family. Thank you all for your support on my original post. If anyone has any advice on how to move forward from here, I'd really appreciate it. How do I heal from this betrayal? How do I make a life for myself when I feel so alone? Any words of wisdom would be appreciated. Update 2, 5 years later. It's been 5 years since my last update, and my life has changed dramatically. I wanted to share what's happened and get some perspective on a recent development. After high school, I threw myself into my studies and work. The pain of losing my family was still raw, but I channeled that pain into determination. I managed to get a scholarship to a state university. I majored in computer science. To make ends meet, I juggled several part-time jobs, working in the university library, freelance web design, and even delivering pizzas at weekends. College was challenging, but also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt free from the constant fear and anxiety that had plagued me while living with Mark. I made friends who became like family. And I even started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of my past. I graduated with honors, landed a job at a promising tech startup right out of college. The work was demanding, with long hours and high pressure. But I thrived on the challenge. It felt good to be valued for my skills and work ethic. It was something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Over the last 3 years, I've worked my way up through the company. I started as a junior developer, But my dedication and innovative ideas caught the attention of senior UPS. Within a year, I was promoted to team leader. And recently, I was appointed lead developer for our main product. Our startup recently secured a huge investment, catapulting us into the big leagues of the tech world. With this came a significant pay rise for me, along with stock options that could be worth a considerable amount if the company continues to grow. For the first time in my life, not only am I financially stable, I'm also comfortable. Bought my first car, moved into a nice flat, and even started putting money aside for the future. All this time, I had no contact with my mum or Mark. It was hard, especially during holidays and milestones, like graduating from college and job promotions. There were nights when I would lie awake wondering. I wondered if my mum ever thought about me, if she ever regretted choosing Mark over me. But I focused on building a new life for myself and creating a chosen family with close friends and mentors. Last week, out of the blue, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was a moment of silence. And then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. It was my mum. Her voice was tired and desperate. Nothing like the confident, loving mother I remembered from my childhood. She told me that she and Mark were having financial difficulties. Apparently Mark had made some bad investments, and they were about to have their house repossessed. The company Mark worked for had gone bankrupt, leaving him unemployed. For the past year, they had used up all their savings and were now drowning in debt. My mother apologized for everything that had happened. Years ago, her voice broke as she admitted that she had realized over time that Mark had manipulated her. She said that she regretted not believing me, and that the guilt had eaten away at her for years. She asked if we could meet to talk things through and try to repair our relationship. I was stunned. I had imagined this moment for years. My mother realizing the truth and reaching out to reconnect. But now that it was happening, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. Hope, anger, sadness, and a lingering sense of betrayal. After a long pause, I agreed to meet her in a cafe. The same one where we had our confrontation 5 years ago. When I arrived, I was surprised to see both my mother and Mark there. My mum looked older and worn. Her hair was grey and her face was lined with worry. Mark seemed to have lost the arrogant air he once had. His shoulders were slumped and his eyes were downcast. They explained their situation in more detail. They were months behind in their mortgage payments, and the bank was threatening to repossess their home. Mark had lost his job when his company went bust, and despite his best efforts, he hadn't been able to find steady work since. My mother's salary as a teacher wasn't enough to cover their debts and living expenses. As they talked, I noticed that the dynamic between them had changed. My mother seemed more assertive. She would often interrupt or correct Mark. Mark, on the other hand, seemed subdued. A far cry from the domineering man I remembered. Then came the real reason for their contact. They asked if I could lend them money to help them get back on their feet. They had heard, through mutual acquaintances, about my success in the tech industry, and thought I might be able to help. I sat there and listened to their plea. I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. They were finally admitting that Mark had lied and manipulated the situation years ago. But another part of me was angry that they only reached out when they needed something from me. My mum reached across the table and took my hand in hers. "I know we don't deserve your help," she said, tears in her eyes. "What we did to you is unforgivable. But we are desperate, or we'd have nowhere else to turn." Mark chimed in. His voice lacked the confidence it once had. "I know you have every right to hate me," he said. "I have treated you terribly. I let my jealousy and insecurity poison everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I am truly sorry for what I have done. Her apology stirred up old memories and pain. I thought of the lonely nights in my tiny flat, struggling to make ends meet. I remembered the feeling of betrayal when my own mother chose to believe a lie over the truth of her son. After they finished talking, I took a deep breath and told them I needed time to think about it. I left the cafe without making any promises. Their pleading eyes followed me as I walked away. Now I'm torn on one hand. I've worked hard for my success, and I don't feel like I owe them anything after the way they treated me. Mark's lies have cost me my relationship with my mother and forced me to fend for myself at a young age. Part of me wants to refuse and let them face the consequences of their actions. On the other hand, despite everything, I still care about my mum. The thought of her being homeless or struggling tugs at my heart. But I'm afraid that if I help them, I'm opening myself up to further manipulation or expectations of continued support. I'm also worried about the impact might have on my own financial stability. Although I'm doing well now, I'm not sure I can afford to help them out without jeopardizing my own future. The startup world is volatile, and there's no guarantee that my current success will continue. There's also the question of forgiveness. Can I really move on from what happened? Is it possible to rebuild a relationship with my mother after such a profound betrayal? And what about Mark? Although he has apologized, can I ever trust him or have him back in my life? I've spent the last week thinking about these questions, unable to come to a decision. I've discussed it with my closest friends and even brought it up in a session with my therapist. Everyone has different opinions, but in the end they all say the same thing. It's my decision to make. Part of me is tempted to help, to be the bigger person and extend an olive branch. Perhaps this could be the first step towards healing old wounds and rebuilding my relationship with my mum. But another part of me is afraid of being hurt again, of opening myself up to pain that I've worked so hard to overcome. So when I read it, I find myself asking Ida again. Should I refuse to help my mum and stepdad financially? After all that's happened, should I give them another chance? Or should I protect myself and the life I've built? I'm at a crossroads, and I could really use some outside perspective.